In the summer of 1941, the world's deadliest invasion was about to begin. A force of over 3 million German soldiers, 3,000 panzers, and thousands of Luftwaffe aircraft stormed east across the Soviet borders. But this was more than just an invasion. It was a war of extermination, a fight for Lebensraum, and the eradication of Bolshevism. This was Operation Barbarossa. Millions would die, and entire cities were erased. But of all the forces marching east, Hitler's Army Group North would endure a nightmare beyond all imagination. Stay with us as we reveal one of history's darkest turning points. Army Group North's strength and strategy. Led by Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lieb, Army Group North was at the tip of Operation Barbarossa. This was a force of 700,000 battle-hardened soldiers, backed by 1,000 tanks, thousands of artillery pieces, and total air superiority, with the Luftwaffe ruling the skies. Their mission was clear: advance rapidly through the Baltic states, isolate the Soviet Northern Front, and lay siege to Leningrad before winter set in. You see, Leningrad was more than a city. It was the beating heart of Soviet industry, culture, and revolution. A place Hitler saw not as a prize to be taken, but as a problem to be erased. His orders were clear: Leningrad must die of starvation. We have no interest in feeding its population. On June 22, 1941, they launched their assault, ripping through the Soviet border with terrifying speed. Blitzkrieg through the Baltics, the start of Operation Barbarossa. After signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Stalin suspected the Germans might turn on him. But when the invasion came, the Red Army was completely caught off guard by the sheer speed and fury of the German advance. German forces stormed into Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia like a tidal wave of fire and steel, crushing everything in their path before the Soviets could react. Meanwhile, Finland launched its own offensive, reclaiming lost territory from the Winter War. Though not officially part of the Axis, Finnish forces advanced into Soviet Karelia, securing key positions, but avoiding direct involvement in Leningrad's siege. While the Finns were advancing in the far north, the Germans advanced with terrifying precision towards Leningrad. Panzers spearheaded the attack, smashing through weak Soviet lines, while mechanized infantry followed, gunning down anyone left standing. Above them, the Luftwaffe dominated the skies, reducing railways, convoys, and supply depots to flaming ruins. City after city fell in quick succession. Kaunas, Riga, and Tallinn were all captured within weeks. What remained of the Red Army in the Baltic states was no longer an organized force, but scattered remnants of shattered divisions. But some Soviet troops refused to retreat, choosing instead to fight to the last man. The further east they moved, the more frequent these standoffs became. And then the terrain itself began to fight back. At first, it looked like another unstoppable blitzkrieg, and every sign pointed to another crushing success. But then, something changed. The deeper the Germans pushed, the more Soviet resistance hardened. Bridges that should have paved the way for panzers were blown apart, delaying the advance. While the Wehrmacht fought on land, the Soviet Baltic fleet, though heavily damaged and partially blockaded, still managed to contribute to the city's defense. Despite Luftwaffe bombings and the loss of key ports, Soviet submarines launched attacks on German ships, and the fleet provided artillery support where possible. Though limited, their presence forced the Germans to dedicate resources to counter them. As the Germans pushed forward, the weight of their own armor slowed them to a crawl on the rough Baltic roads, turning their convoys into easy targets for Soviet ambushes. In the dense forests of Estonia and northern USSR, Soviet partisans lurked like ghosts, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Under the cover of night, they ambushed convoys, sabotaged railways, and cut crucial supply lines. The faster the Germans advanced, the thinner their supply lines stretched, and suddenly they weren't able to move as fast as they had expected. Despite all the setbacks, by September, Army Group North reached Leningrad and began encircling the suburban areas. Now, at the very doorstep of their objective, the war was about to take a turn that no one in the German high command had predicted. Soviet defenders fought desperately on the outskirts of Leningrad, but the growing thunder of German artillery and Luftwaffe bombing runs rained destruction on it. The siege of Leningrad had begun, and so had the nightmare for Army Group North. Just as they reached the city, the first snowflakes began to fall. Winter had arrived early, one of the coldest in decades. Inside the city, food disappeared, thousands starved, and corpses lay frozen in the streets. Desperation set in. The weak became prey. They were murdered for scraps of bread. Neighbors, even family turned on each other to survive. And when there was nothing left, some did the unthinkable. The NKVD recorded hundreds of cases of cannibalism, the dead becoming the only means to stay alive. Meanwhile, outside Leningrad, the German army tightened its grip from the south and east, while Finnish forces held their positions to the north. However, the Finns did not participate directly in siege operations and maintained their defensive line, focusing on securing their reclaimed territories. This left a crucial gap in the blockade, allowing the Soviets to find ways to keep the city alive, and in a siege, that was a fatal mistake. Despite constant artillery bombardment, starvation, and disease, the people of Leningrad held on. When supplies within the city ran out, the Soviets found another way, something that would help save the people inside of the city. Across Lake Ladoga, the Soviets built the Road of Life. As the lake froze over, convoys of trucks raced across the ice, carrying food, ammunition, and medicine into the city, while also evacuating millions of sick and wounded Soviets. When the ice melted, Soviet ships took over, ferrying crucial supplies across Lake Ladoga into Leningrad. German artillery shelled the convoys, and the Luftwaffe tried to destroy the lifeline, but the Soviets rebuilt it every time. Without it, the city would have been wiped off the map. And finally, in January 1943, led by General Govorov, the Soviets launched Operation Iskra, a hammer blow designed to break through the German blockade. The attack succeeded in opening a narrow land corridor to Leningrad. This allowed limited supplies to reach the city. But soon after, the fight began to intensify. Soviet artillery smashed German defensive lines, sending fire and steel crashing down on Army Group North. Then, Soviet tanks surged forward, while infantry poured into enemy positions, engaging in brutal close-quarters combat. Meanwhile, the Baltic fleet continued to unleash its full force, sinking German and Finnish ships. Unable to withstand the onslaught, the Germans began to collapse. By January 1944, the 872-day siege was finally over when a massive Soviet offensive drove the Germans away for good. Leningrad had survived. But for Army Group North, the war was far from finished. The Red Army was now on the hunt. As the Red Army surged forward, Hitler refused to let his troops retreat. The once mighty Army Group North was now crumbling, battered, and outnumbered. By October 1944, Soviet forces cut off Army Group North completely, trapping over 200,000 German troops in what became known as the Courland Pocket. The soldiers who had once stood at the gates of Leningrad were now surrounded on the Baltic coast, isolated from the rest of the war. For months, despite having no real path to victory, the Germans continued to fight, but Army Group North's fate had been sealed. They would hold out until May 1945, surrendering only after Berlin itself had fallen. Army Group North, once an unstoppable force, had been reduced to a stranded, starving remnant of its former power.